All right, so today we're going to run through the final events that lead up to the actual start of the war in Europe. Specifically, going to look at the aggressiveness of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And one thing we highlight on the guided notes here is that UK and France, either because of their own will or there's a public opinion in their own countries or lack of foresight, won't be able to halt the aggressive policies of Nazi Germany. And the first of these aggressive policies, overt aggressive policies, is the invasion of Italy by Mussolini, sorry, the invasion of Ethiopia by Mussolini in Italy. And this was overt aggression. Ethiopia, remember, was one of the last countries to hold out after colonial expansion through all of. And for some reason, Mussolini gets it in his mind that he needs to have this kind of last little piece of the African pie, so to speak. The emperor at the time, Haile Selassie, appeals to the League of Nations, as you can see in this newspaper clipping from October 4th, 1935, but it's kind of in vain. Mussolini will attack, as this picture shows, from Eritrea and also Somalia, which is actually split between British, French, and Italian Somali areas, and they bomb it. They bomb it brutally. And they get it. They win it. The British, the French, and the League of Nations are going to push for action, but they really don't do anything. They kind of let Mussolini go. That same year, Hitler announces plans to increase the size of the armed forces. There will be no pushback whatsoever, which is weird because this was a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany wants to remilitarize the Rhineland, which once again is a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The Rhineland was supposed to be forever devoid of any sort of German presence, but Hitler doesn't care. They do so. They ended up actually remilitarizing it in March 1936, and in doing so violate the Treaty of Versailles as well as the Locarno treaties. Why does France do nothing? It says in your textbook that Hitler says this, that if France had put up a fight, then Germans would have had to run away with their tail tucked between their legs. Hitler recognizes that if France had put up any sort of attack, then this would have been over. But they don't. Why? Why is there no response from France? That's a big question we need to deal with as we look through the era that we call the late 1930s in Europe, which is the era of appeasement. Why does France do nothing? First and foremost, the general hatred of war. Certainly World War I is in the minds of most of the people who are alive. It just had ended 18 years before. Almost all the soldiers who did actually make it out of the fighting remember. They're still young, 35, 40. It's not like they're grandparents of a younger generation. They're adults who are kind of just entering into their maturity phase, especially if they were young fighting in the war. Second was a lack of enthusiasm for any sort of military spending. Remember as well, so much money seemed to be wasted on World War I. I think that we pulled up the statistic that everybody in Europe, Soviet Union, United States, Canada combined could have been bought a house. There's not a sense of anymore like this was a giant waste of time. Why would we militarize and build up our armies just to engage in another meaningless war? There was also the feeling that Germany had been dealt too harshly with, and that maybe, France and Great Britain needed to give them a little bit of space and a little bit of room to regrow their military, given the fact that they are, at this point, recovered from the Depression more or less and very, very strong. So there's kind of a guilt feeling associated with the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler, of course, will mask his true goals. Obviously, he always says, if you give me this, then I'll be done, right? One more thing, one more thing, one more thing, and then I'll be done. And of course, he's not going to honor any of the agreements that he puts forward as he keeps marching his troops around Europe and really invading other countries that hold other Germans. There's a fear of the Japanese and Italian aggression. There's not necessarily a fear that Germany will be the primary power that will basically imperialize and destroy either Europe or Japan is, especially after watching the Rape of Nanking, and the invasion of China, is seen as the primary aggressor. And Italy, we've already mentioned, and this, by the way, is a Wikipedia page if you want to read up on this. Um, Italy overtly invaded a neutral nation. Hitler doesn't do that. Well, not directly. He at least, calls for kind of annexations of areas that hold Germans instead of overtly invading a country. And as soon as he kind of does that, that's the last straw, and that's going to be Poland in 1939. Finally, why was there no response? There's a fear of communism if Hitler was overthrown. This was specifically put forward by the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Neville Chamberlain. Communism is still a fear. At least we know with Hitler that he's not communist. And the Red Scare of the 1920s, the mentality that a worldwide communist revolution could still take place, that's still a very large possibility. And so the idea was, if we could avoid a communist takeover, maybe we can deal with a fascist dictator who is Hitler and Mussolini. The Soviet response to this, Stalin actually helps Hitler come to power, not by campaigning for him, but by preventing German communists from cooperating with other leftists. Stalin could have flooded Germany with Bolshevik revolutionaries, communist revolutionaries, and he doesn't do it. He purposely kind of leaves it alone. The idea is that he wants to do business with Germany. He wants to kind of trade raw materials for finished goods, but Hitler's not interested at all. So what's going to happen is Stalin begins to move away from Hitler. He looks to the United States, he looks to the League of Nations to see if there's anyone that wants to do business with him. And as a result, Stalin and the Soviet Union sign what is known as a Mutual Assistance Treaty of 1935 with France and Czechoslovakia. Once again, here is the Wikipedia page for that if you want to look this up. By the way, I love this stuff about Wikipedia, right? Foreign alliances of France. You can look at all of them, right? Here we go. Franco-Polish, Franco-Russian, Franco-Italian. That didn't last long, right? 1935, that's broken. And then 1936 to 39, we have the Franco-Soviet Treaty. The idea here, and this also includes Czechoslovakia, is that all these three powers had an agreement that if they were attacked, France had to come to the aid of the two countries first. So just because Germany attacked France, it didn't mean that Soviet Union had to come to the aid of France. So it was kind of like a one-way directional alliance. But the idea was still, as Germany gets bigger, to put some pressure on them to kind of instill the fear of God that they would need to fight a two-front war again if Germany decided to be aggressive. Stalin also will approve communists in other countries to work against German aggression. So just not Germany. They prevent aggression in Poland, and other areas in Eastern Europe, but they're not necessarily looking to get involved in Germany. Still, the Soviets are very concerned with the Germans when Germany, Japan, and Italy signed what is known as the Anti-Comintern Pact. Remember, the Comintern is the Worldwide Association of Communist Powers. And they signed a pact that says, hey, we are against all communism. So this seems to be the final straw for Stalin, in that he's watching what will become actually the Axis powers signing a pact to be explicitly not communist. As a result of this, when the Spanish Civil War breaks out in the late 1930s, let me pull this up. Actually, what will happen is Stalin will send aid to the Spanish leftist forces. Italy and Germany will, of course, support the rightist forces. Germany will kind of use this war as kind of practice for World War II. They send down a lot of their bombing regiments, one specifically known as the Condor Regiment, bombed mercilessly against the Spanish left. And they're supporting a rightist general known as Francisco Franco. And Francisco Franco will come to power. He'll win in 1939. And he'll be in power till the 1970s. There are those in the United States, Canada. Emma Goldman, remember, our anarchists from the turn of the 20th century, is going to actually fight with the Spanish government against Franco. The U.S. though never officially enters the war overtly. We never send troops, but there are many U.S. volunteers who go, including the author Ernest Hemingway. So as a result of that, the Soviets are more or less pacified. They're fighting in proxy wars, but there's not any sense that, you know, the Soviets are super willing to fight against Germany, even as they're growing and kind of stretching and remilitarizing. What really changes that is the behavior of the Germans in 1938 and 1939. Let me go back to the guided notes real quick. Um, by the way, feel free to pause this if you want to fill this in. I just went over all this stuff. So German aggression, 1938 and 1939. So the goal of Hitler is something known as Anschluss, okay? And this is the name for the combination with Austria. Austria is, of course, a German-speaking country. And there's always been this sense, ever since Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, that Austria should be part of Germany. And so that's going to be a major goal as we kind of roll through 1938. And what he's calling for with Anschluss is unification of all German people in what is known as a Reich, or the German word for realm or empire. Okay. He also wants what we've already mentioned in class, Lebensraum, which is living space. Right. This would be the area in Eastern Europe where inferior people like Slavs and Jews go and work on these kind of modern day feudal estates. And of course, like I mentioned before, this should be this should make the Soviets nervous. They should be thinking, interesting, Lebensraum. This seems to be a main goal. Where is it going to be? Oh, it's going to be right next to Russia. That probably isn't going to sit well. And you know what is shocking actually is that Hitler and Stalin will sign a non-aggression pact, which we'll get to later. I've already mentioned that in class. Anschluss, of course, does occur in 1938. The French and the British only protest. Once again, this isn't a blatant invasion of a neutral country. Most who are living in Austria at the time are completely comfortable with Anschluss. And you know, it's not like the Western world can really say this is overt aggressiveness. They are invading a neutral country, so therefore we need to go to war. But still, Hitler keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. What we get is what is known as the Munich Agreement in late 1938. And this was the cession of the Sudetenland. Okay, I'll pull up a map right here. The Sudetenland, and this is kind of this light orange around Czechoslovakia right here. And, you know, the Sudetenland is in Czechoslovakia, and it includes, as you might have guessed, many German-speaking people. So the idea was, once again, we're going to annex and get some of our German-speaking peoples back into our Reich. But notice how Germany's growing, right? Austria has been incorporated in 1938. The Rhineland had been remilitarized in 1936. The Saarland was incorporated. This was actually a coalfield area right in the border of France. So Germany, once again, is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. They're missing Danzig. They lost Danzig in the Treaty of Versailles, and they also lost Memel. Okay, so Germany is actually going to try and grow, and will actually grow to an area larger than pre-World War I by these constant annexations of territory. And the prime minister who mainly lets this happen is Neville Chamberlain. And Neville Chamberlain is kind of who we point the finger at the most for appeasement. Of course, we could point it at the United States as well. We're not really doing that much. But he orchestrates this Munich Agreement. And I like this quote right here. I'm going to read it. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for our two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German Naval Agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again. We are resolved that the method of consultation shall be the method adopted to deal with any other questions that may concern our two countries. We are determined to continue our efforts to remove possible sources of difference and thus to contribute to assure the peace of Europe. And this is right when he gets off the plane. This was what he said right here. He gets off the plane. Then another statement later that day. My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany bringing peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time. Go home and get a a nice quiet sleep. So this, of course, September 1938, you know, Neville Chamberlain is kind of a fool for this. Hitler has no intention of this being it, and within a year they're back at war. So, you know, appeasement, this believing of Hitler's, you know, altruism, the fact he can be trusted, is just not true. Also, France is hiding behind something that they have constructed, known as the Maginot Line. This is, as I defined here, a defensive fortification system built on France's eastern front between 1929 and 1934. And you can see here, this would be kind of a you know, an intense section of the Maginot Line, right? Bunkers and underground caves and control chambers and casemates and air, you know, well, there's an air conditioning plant. So man, air conditioning is pretty nice. Anti-tank ditches, all this sort of stuff. That was supposedly supposed to be an impregnable defense, right? If you remember from World War I, all of their fortresses were seemingly impregnable. So that doesn't really happen. Hitler, when he decides to invade, is going to go straight through these fortifications quite easily. And really, he doesn't even have to go through that. He can go around, once again, through the Schlieffen Plan, through Belgium, and strike at Paris, which is exactly what he'll do. By the end of 1939, Hitler would take over the rest of Czechoslovakia. This is this yellow. All right, and this is March 1939, so Czechoslovakia falls. He'll get Memel from Lithuania in March 1939 as well. They want Danzig from Poland. Also at this time, Italy will annex Albania in 1939. So once again, Italian aggression is going to kind of be running rampant as well. Great Britain finally awakens to the problem. Public opinion is going to swell against this policy of appeasement, against the aggression of Hitler. And they finally say enough's enough. They draw a line in the sand, and the line is Poland. They tell Hitler if he invades Poland at any point in time that they will be at war. Okay, that's exactly what happens on September 1st, 1939. Now, what is the U.S. doing here? Well, the thing is, they're not doing much of anything. The U.S. has mixed emotions over Hitler and Mussolini's aggressive actions. Some concern there is some concern in the United States over the persecution of Jews and the threat to European democracies, but some, like a strong Germany, against a Soviet communism. Once again, we've mentioned communism seems to be a much bigger threat than fascism. The intervention in World War I was seen as a mistake, even though we didn't lose as many as Europe did at the time. We also have a lack of money, all right, to divert to Europe during our depression. So as a result, we pass a series of neutrality acts, which actually makes the United States even more neutral than we were before World War I. Some of these provisions included not even riding on any belligerent ships at all. So to avoid kind of the same scenario as a Lusitania, one of the neutrality acts passed said that no passenger liners, no American could ride on these passenger liners. We are officially neutral in the Spanish Civil War as well. Like I said, we've sent volunteers over, but we do not have a policy of support. And so we pursue appeasement with Europe throughout the late 1930s. We're way more concerned with Japan. But the tide does turn, like in Europe, with the annexation of Czechoslovakia and Albania by the Italians. Hitler is going to view the United States as backwards, slow, degenerate, incompetent. It's kind of a similar underestimation that the World War I leaders thought as well. And Roosevelt, over time, is going to move past neutrality. And he sees really by 1938, 39, 40 that we need to deal with a Nazi threat. Of course, Congress does not change its mind, so we're actually going to have a division between Roosevelt's policy of intervention and Congress's policy of isolationism. As the war gets started, Germany realizes they need to avoid a two-front war. The France and United Kingdom believe a strong alliance with the Soviet Union was still necessary to some extent, but that changes a little bit. The French and the Soviets get suspicious of each other. The UK and the Soviets also get suspicious of each other. They never hammer out what an actual defensive alliance looks like. So this Franco-Soviet Mutual Assistance Treaty is more or less a paper tiger. Stalin will change his mind about Hitler, which is really truly shocking, and he signs what is known as the German-Soviet Pact, also known as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And during this time period, they make a trade agreement here. Germany will exchange manufactured goods for Soviet raw materials, and then also that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union have a 10-year non-aggression pact in which each signatory promised not to attack the other. So, at the time, Hitler's not saying we'll never attack you, but we're just going to give you 10 years here. And he's hoping that he can knock out the rest of Europe and avoid having a two-front war. But there's no sense at all that Hitler will avoid attacking Russia for forever. Like I've said, he's written very clearly that Lebensraum is a goal of the German Reich, and so he'll push to do this eventually. Once again, shocking that Stalin would ignore the other Western powers and pursue a non-aggression alliance with Hitler, which, by the way, is very short-lived. It'll divide Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. This is kind of a secret provision of this. Some Eastern European states will be under the sphere of influence of the Soviets, and some will be under the sphere of influence of the Germans. And so as a result of this non-aggression pact, Germany is no longer fearful of a two-front war. They attacked Poland on September 1st, 1939. 2 days later, on September 3rd, 1939, Great Britain and France would declare war. And as a result of these declarations, we officially are at World War II in Europe. And this is where we'll stop with Chapter 17. Please enjoy the questions. Make sure to use this video and the guided notes as well. Thanks.